The hangar buzzed with the usual low hum of machinery, clanking tools, and murmured instructions. Grease-stained uniforms moved like clockwork, each person knowing their role, their place in the pecking order. Among them was someone who, to many, didn't quite fit. She stood out, not for any lack of skill, but because she wasn't who they expected. A young woman, her brown skin smudged with oil, her hair tucked beneath a cap, and a small notebook always tucked under her arm. She walked with quiet confidence, though the room treated her like a shadow. When she first arrived, the looks came before the words. Raised eyebrows, sideways glances, lingering stares. Then came the whispers. They didn't say it out loud, but she heard it in the chuckles when she passed, in the way they double-checked every bolt she tightened, in how the senior techs reran tests she had already completed. To them, she was just a girl with a scholarship and a clipboard, not someone who belonged elbow-deep in an engine room that had seen nothing but hardened men and tradition for decades. She remembered her first assignment clearly. It wasn't glamorous, a routine diagnostic on a high-performance naval prototype engine. But she treated it like gold. As others joked about her presence, she methodically ran through every wire, every line of code, every pressure point. Her hands worked faster than most of theirs, and her mind moved even faster. But none of that mattered, not yet. The perception was set before she touched a wrench. In the break room, she sat alone, her notebook open, while others swapped stories about deployments and past missions. They barely acknowledged her. One mechanic cracked a joke loud enough for her to hear, asking if the engine would come back with glitter and perfume. Laughter followed. She didn't look up. She just wrote something in her notebook and turned the page. Even her supervisor, a man with 20 years under his belt and a chest full of commendations, treated her like an intern playing make-believe. He offered basic instructions, rarely asking for input, never acknowledging the details she added to the schematics. When she corrected a wiring diagram and avoided what would have been a critical failure during a live run, he simply grunted and walked away without a word. Every day felt like walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. Still, she kept showing up. She came in earlier than required, stayed longer than expected. When others were grabbing coffee or stepping out for smoke breaks, she was studying combustion models or tweaking calibration sequences that even the senior engineers didn't fully understand. She wasn't trying to prove anything. Not anymore. She just knew what she was capable of, even if no one else did. Her hands were calloused. Her eyes carried a quiet fire, but all they saw was her gender, her skin, her silence. One afternoon, a newer recruit, younger, fresh out of training, approached her in the corner of the hangar. He asked if he could borrow her notes, not because he respected her work, but because he assumed she was the assistant. When she handed him a diagram, he paused. "You drew this?" he asked, visibly surprised. She didn't answer. She didn't need to, but that moment lingered. That surprise, that disbelief, was the common thread running through every interaction she had in the hangar. No one expected her to know what she knew. No one expected her to lead, to innovate, to teach. She was supposed to just observe, maybe assist. She was not supposed to improve systems. She was not supposed to touch the core configuration files or modify the test sequence protocols. And yet, she did. The doubts weren't always loud. Sometimes they came in the form of being left off a group email, or a tool being misplaced just before a major test, or being asked if she needed help lifting something she'd already moved twice. They came in smirks, in half-hearted nods, in praise that sounded more like surprise than recognition. But none of it broke her, didn't even bend her. She absorbed it, quietly, like heat in metal, pressure that only made her stronger. Every doubt became fuel. Every slight, a sharpening stone. She wasn't there to convince them. She was there to do the work. And whether they accepted it or not, she was doing it better than most. She kept her head down, not out of submission, but focus. Because while they were watching her with narrowed eyes, she was watching the engine, listening to it, learning from it, understanding it in a way that no one else bothered to. They didn't see it yet, but something was coming. Something only she would recognize. Something she'd left behind, quiet, small, deliberate. And it would change everything. The early hours of the morning became her sanctuary. Long before the others shuffled into the hangar with coffee cups and tired eyes, she was already there, standing in front of the engine like it was a puzzle waiting to be solved. The cold air carried the scent of oil and metal, and the silence felt sacred. This was the time she could work without the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. No one watched her. No one doubted her. In those moments, it was just her and the machine. She developed a rhythm, a personal ritual. Tools aligned just so. Data sheets laid out in a specific order. She always wore the same worn gloves, not because she needed them, but because they carried the memory of every breakthrough, every late-night tweak, every moment of clarity. Each wire she traced with her fingers was like reading a familiar story. Each bolt she tightened felt like writing her name in a language only she understood. In the corners of the hangar, she worked on systems others ignored. She took on the messy, the repetitive, the seemingly mundane. She rewired faulty panels, logged performance inconsistencies, adjusted fuel-air mixtures by fractions so small they would have gone unnoticed. The team followed protocol, she followed instinct backed by relentless study. Manuals lay dog-eared in her locker. She memorized them, then went beyond them. She reverse-engineered design principles, questioned every standard setting, and ran simulations on her personal laptop late into the night. She wasn't just fixing, she was learning, and in learning, she was reshaping. No one handed her responsibility. She took it in pieces, subtly. At first, she was only allowed to run diagnostics, but she stayed behind after everyone left and ran them again, deeper, smarter. When she saw inconsistencies, she didn't report them to her supervisor right away. She confirmed them with secondary systems, cross-checked wiring diagrams, and predicted what would fail, not if, but when. Eventually, those predictions came true. And even though credit wasn't given, her print was already on the work. She never raised her voice. She never asked to be seen. Her power came in silence, in precision. She documented everything meticulously. Every modification was logged. Every result was recorded, labeled, and filed. Her notebooks filled up quickly, their pages packed with calculations, annotations, diagrams, and observations that could rival any senior technician's report. They weren't just notes. They were blueprints of progress, chapter by chapter. The other engineers still overlooked her, but slowly her shadow began to stretch. One day, a hydraulic glitch halted a major test. The usual crew scrambled, confused, blaming the equipment. She stepped forward, spoke only once, pointing to a bypass valve others had forgotten existed. They tried it, and the engine came alive. No one thanked her, but no one forgot either. Every challenge they threw at her, she met with unshakable calm. She fixed a 3-day delay in 2 hours. She traced a circuit fault down to a manufacturer's error and drafted a better configuration. She calibrated the engine's output sensors by hand when the software failed. The systems began to run cleaner, faster, smoother. Supervisors scratched their heads, unsure how it was happening. She kept quiet, only nodding when they spoke to her in half-hearted compliments. Outside the hangar, she kept building. She enrolled in extra training sessions under aliases, absorbed open-source military design journals, and quietly submitted improvement suggestions under her ID code. She didn't care who saw the name, only that the work was right. She modified an intake algorithm in her own time, improving fuel efficiency by 7%. When that adjustment was implemented during a test run, supposedly by someone else, she watched silently from the back, hands folded, a small smile on her face. Her body bore the fatigue of effort that wasn't acknowledged. Her knees ached from crouching under consoles for hours. Her back stiffened from long nights spent hunched over her diagrams. She rarely took breaks, often forgot meals, but her eyes remained bright, focused. There was a spark that refused to dim, even when the world around her did everything it could to ignore it. The veterans didn't see the quiet revolutions she was leading under their noses. They missed the changes she made to systems they thought were already perfect. They didn't know she had already overhauled portions of the engine's performance architecture, section by section, without permission, without recognition. But the machine knew. It ran better. It hummed differently. It responded to her touch, like a creature that recognized its true mechanic. In the silence, she became the architect of something bigger than herself. Not with grand speeches or declarations, but with the consistency of someone who knew they were right even when no one listened. She worked in the background, unnoticed, unthanked, and yet every part of the engine whispered her name. It started with a mark. Small, precise, and hidden in a place no one would bother to look. Tucked behind a sealed panel near the engine's intake manifold. It wasn't random. It wasn't decorative. It was intentional. A carved line, intersected by 2 dots and a symbol that, to the untrained eye, looked like a scratch left by a slipped screwdriver. But for those who knew, it was unmistakable. It was her way of saying, "I was here and I understood this better than you thought." The mark had a story. It was something her grandfather had shown her, long before she ever dreamed of stepping into a naval hangar. He was a former SEAL mechanic, quiet and reserved, a man who kept his medals buried in a drawer and his knowledge tucked in the edges of conversation. One summer afternoon, he showed her how to etch metal with meaning, how to leave behind a symbol that could speak louder than credentials, louder than words. It was a code, an unspoken signature used by select SEAL teams during covert modifications, something not even the official manuals recorded. A way for one silent expert to say to another, "You can trust this." She never thought she'd use it. Not in this way, not here. But after months of being dismissed and minimized, after fixing and perfecting systems only to have the credit handed elsewhere, she felt compelled to leave something behind. Not for glory, not even to be seen, but for truth. The mark didn't scream, it whispered. To the right eyes, it would speak volumes. She chose the placement carefully. The area she modified wasn't part of the standard checklist. It required opening a section that most teams avoided because of how tedious it was to access. But she knew it mattered. She had discovered an airflow imbalance, one that subtly decreased thrust output during longer operations. Her recalibration corrected the issue and shaved milliseconds off the response time. She documented it, as always, but she knew no one would read the report. So she left the mark. Etching it was more emotional than she expected. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what it meant. She wasn't just correcting a system anymore. She was planting a flag in her own quiet war. Every line of the symbol felt like defiance. Every curve a reminder that despite everything, she knew exactly what she was doing. She ran her thumb over the finished piece and exhaled. It was done. Invisible to most, unmistakable to the few who mattered. Days passed. Tests continued. The engine performed flawlessly. Her modification held, humming through every trial without a single error. Supervisors praised the system integrity, without knowing why it had improved. Some credited better maintenance, others simply moved on. No one asked questions. But she knew what she had done. She returned to the engine during off hours just to hear it run. Smooth, confident, and hers. She began to etch small marks in other places, always hidden, always justified. Not vandalism signatures. She only did it when the change was significant, when she'd made something better, safer, more efficient. The marks were never clustered, never repeated, but always carried that same cryptic shape. A design passed down through hands that had once been covered in oil and blood and purpose. Then came the inspection. A visiting team arrived, headed by a SEAL captain with years of combat and field diagnostics under his belt. Tall, composed, silent. He moved through the facility with a sharp gaze, taking in every detail. When he reached the engine she had worked on, the room went still. Engineers stood at attention. Supervisors spoke in clipped, rehearsed tones. She watched from a distance, unnoticed, like always. The captain said little. He reviewed the schematics, cross-checked with physical hardware, and finally requested to see the panel, that panel. The one no one ever touched. Tools were fetched, bolts unscrewed. The panel came off slowly. And then, in the quiet, his eyes locked onto the mark. He didn't say anything. His hand hovered near it, fingers barely touching the edge. For a moment his face changed. Not shock, not confusion, recognition. He stepped back. The others looked at him, unsure. He turned to the senior engineer and asked, flatly, who had last worked on the intake modifications. Papers were shuffled. Names were mentioned. But none of them matched the signature he had just seen. His expression shifted, more serious now, as if he had just walked into a room where someone had left behind a message meant only for him. She stood still, heart pounding, watching the quiet storm begin to form around something no one else even understood. The day of the inspection began like any other, cloaked in routine and the faint scent of burned metal and lubricant. The hangar was cleaner than usual, swept and polished as if dust alone might discredit their work. Clipboards were passed around. Engineers reviewed checklists with trembling fingers, trying to anticipate what questions might be asked. Supervisors straightened their uniforms more than once, exchanging clipped, quiet glances as the arrival time drew closer. She had already finished her prep hours ago. Her part of the engine was done, not just tested but perfected. Every reading sat within optimal range, every calibration locked, every potential issue resolved before it could even be noticed. And yet, no one asked her to join the prep team. She wasn't listed on any formal roster for the presentation. No one requested her notes or invited her to the technical briefing. She stood off to the side, arms crossed, observing the flurry of nervous energy like a ghost among the living. The hum of a vehicle engine cut through the tension. A matte black SUV rolled to a stop outside the hangar doors. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Conversations died mid-sentence. Eyes turned, posture straightened. From the passenger side, he stepped out, tall, sharply dressed in a pressed navy uniform, the insignia on his chest gleaming even in the low light. He moved with deliberate calm, like a man who had seen chaos and no longer flinched at it. A SEAL captain, one of the highest-ranking men to visit the site in years. The commanding officer of the hangar greeted him with the kind of overly polite urgency that comes from both respect and fear. The captain listened without emotion, offering nothing more than a nod. He had one request. He wanted to inspect the prototype engine, personally, thoroughly, and without interruption. No demonstrations, no walkthroughs, just access. The team scrambled to accommodate. Covers were removed. Diagnostic ports were opened. Data sheets were stacked in neat piles. The captain stepped into the bay with the presence of someone used to walking into situations no one else dared approach. He didn't speak much. His eyes, however, said everything. He scanned every detail, touched surfaces with his gloved fingers, and listened to the engine like it might whisper its secrets to him. She watched from the far end, silent as always, her heart a steady drumbeat against her ribs. No one had warned her he would come. No one had mentioned this inspection would reach that deep. And yet, a part of her had always known this moment would arrive. It was why she had made the mark. Not for this captain specifically, but for someone like him. Someone who could see beyond paper, beyond rank, beyond protocol. He moved slowly toward the intake panel. The room stiffened. One of the engineers tried to intervene, suggesting that the section had already been cleared. The captain raised a single hand, firm, calm, and the room fell silent again. He motioned for the panel to be opened. Confused glances passed among the team. It was a sealed section, hard to reach, not part of the scheduled review. But they obeyed. Tools clanked softly as bolts were removed. A technician peeled back the access cover, revealing the complex weave of wires and ports beneath. The captain leaned in, inspecting the interior carefully. And then his eyes paused, just for a second, but long enough. His fingers hovered just above the etched mark. They didn't touch it, not yet. He tilted his head slightly, the way someone does when trying to confirm something they never expected to see. His face didn't show surprise. It showed recognition, the kind that comes from memory, from experience. He had seen it before, maybe years ago, maybe in a different theater of war, but he knew it. That symbol, etched by someone who understood not just the machine, but the unspoken language of those who lived in its shadows. He finally touched it gently with the back of his knuckle. A soft breath escaped his nose, the only sound he made. Then he turned to the commanding officer and asked a simple question. Who was responsible for this section? Confusion spread. The senior technician listed off names, double-checked logs, named engineers who hadn't even touched that part of the system. Her name wasn't on the sheet. It rarely was. She remained still in the background, waiting, watching. The captain didn't press. He simply nodded, then closed the panel himself, sealing it back with steady hands. He looked around the room again, his expression unreadable. Something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but irreversibly. The silence in the hangar wasn't loud, but it was weighted. It pressed down like a fog, thick with questions no one dared to voice. The SEAL captain had barely spoken since discovering the hidden mark, but his demeanor had shifted, noticeably. No longer merely observing, he now moved with a deeper focus, slower, sharper, as if he were peeling back layers invisible to everyone else in the room. His inspection had become something more than protocol. He began requesting specific system readings, not just surface-level reports, but deep diagnostic data that only someone intimately familiar with the engine would even know existed. Most of the senior engineers glanced nervously at one another. They weren't prepared for this level of scrutiny. A few tried to stall, offering rehearsed explanations, but the captain didn't bite. He waited, arms folded, eyes steady. As the room scrambled to catch up, she remained in the background, back against the wall, notebook in hand. Her heart beat steady, but she felt the change rippling outward like a tide. Something had been unlocked. Something unspoken but undeniable. The captain hadn't named her. He hadn't looked directly at her. But somehow it felt like he already knew, or at least suspected. The technicians brought over logs. Data streams filled monitors. The captain reviewed everything in silence, his finger occasionally tapping against the screen, signaling discrepancies. The intake pressure on run 47. The split-second delay in throttle response. The corrected fuel ratio. Adjustments that weren't standard. Adjustments that weren't documented officially but had clearly been made. Improvements. He looked at the commanding officer. These changes, who authorized them? Another shuffle of papers. Another list of names. Her name wasn't there. It was never there. She watched the officer stumble through an answer, caught between bureaucratic explanations and visible confusion. The captain didn't press. He simply nodded and walked back toward the engine. For a moment it looked like the inspection was over, that he would thank the team, sign a document, and move on. But then, he did something none of them expected. He asked to run the engine. Not in test mode. Not on simulation. Full manual operation. Live. Everyone paused. That wasn't protocol. Not without higher clearance. Not without a scheduled demonstration. But protocol no longer mattered. When a SEAL captain makes a request like that, hesitation isn't an option. The team moved quickly, prepping the space. Safety checks were hastily run. Warnings blinked on then off across the main display. The engine came to life. It roared, not with the staggered startup they were used to, but with clean, immediate ignition. The hum was smoother, tighter, like a living thing exhaling after being held too long. The captain stood motionless, eyes closed, listening not to the volume, but to the precision beneath it. The way the systems harmonized, the rhythm of its power delivery. The others heard noise. He heard something else. He asked for throttle modulation 30%, then 60%, then full burst. She held her breath as the engine responded flawlessly to each command. No lag, no resistance. The output was cleaner than ever before. This wasn't just a functioning system. It was optimized, tuned like a symphony, balanced not just mechanically, but intuitively. The captain nodded once, signaling the engine to be powered down. As the hum faded into silence, he turned to the room. No speech, no congratulations, just a quiet pause as he looked across the faces, the ones confused, the ones proud, the ones pretending. Then his gaze stopped. It didn't scan anymore. It landed on her. Their eyes met for the first time. Not long, not theatrically, but with a weight that sent a wave of stillness through her spine. He didn't smile. He didn't gesture. But something passed between them, an unspoken recognition that didn't require explanation. He broke the silence with a single statement. Whoever made those changes knows this machine better than anyone else in this room. The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Everyone turned to one another, then slowly toward her, realization creeping in like sunlight through a crack. The supervisors didn't speak. The senior engineers stood motionless. No one argued. No one dismissed. Because for the first time, the proof wasn't in her words or her reports or her quiet endurance. It was in the roar of the engine, in the stillness of the captain, in the fact that someone who had seen war, who had trusted his life to machines like this one, had paused not for authority, not for protocol, but for truth. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't need to, because in that moment, without announcement or ceremony, the room shifted. Not loudly, but completely. The room didn't go back to normal after the captain's words. Couldn't. Something had been acknowledged that had lingered beneath the surface for months. Unspoken, inconvenient, quietly dismissed until it could no longer be ignored. People who once walked past her without a second glance now hesitated before they moved. They looked at her differently. Not with admiration yet, not quite, but with uncertainty, like they were reconsidering everything they thought they knew. The hangar that had once been cold and dismissive was now humming with a subtle discomfort, the kind that happens when a truth slips through the cracks of an old system. She still kept her head down, still showed up early, still stayed late, still carried her notebook tucked under one arm. But the silence around her had changed. Conversations paused when she walked by, not from malice, but from the discomfort of unspoken guilt. Some of the same men who used to joke about her behind her back now nodded slightly when they passed her. A few even tried to ask her questions, careful, awkward, half-hearted questions about her methods, her calibration process, her thoughts on intake timing. She answered only when necessary, never bitter, but never over-explaining. She had nothing to prove anymore. One of the junior engineers, the same one who once mistook her for an assistant, approached her one afternoon with an open schematic in hand. His voice was quieter this time, more respectful. He asked for help, not as a formality but as a genuine request. She glanced at his work, offered a few quick corrections, then handed it back. He murmured a thank you, eyes down. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just nodded and returned to her task. The SEAL captain never came back, not in person. But a week later, a letter arrived addressed to the department. It didn't mention names. It didn't offer praise. It simply stated that the modifications found during the inspection were among the most precise and intuitively engineered adjustments seen in recent evaluations. It recommended that whoever was responsible be considered for advanced project leadership. No one said anything aloud, but everyone in the hangar knew exactly who that recommendation was meant for. Her name finally appeared on the logbook. Not once, but across multiple entries. Tasks she had always done in silence were now being documented, initialed. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was a beginning. The same supervisor who once dismissed her quietly began assigning her to more complex systems. He didn't praise her. He didn't apologize, but he stopped second-guessing her work. That, in itself, felt louder than words. Weeks passed, then months. The prototype engine, the same one she had reconfigured piece by piece, was selected for field testing on an active fleet. The announcement was made in a dry memo, buried in a stack of morning updates. But when she saw it, a flicker of pride stirred in her chest. The machine she had poured herself into, every wire, every adjustment, every signature mark was going into the world. It would run not just because it passed a checklist, but because she had made it worthy of trust. Other changes followed. New recruits began arriving, and with them came a subtle shift in the culture. The old guard still lingered, still held their traditions, but there was less resistance now. She started to see more questions, more curiosity, less arrogance. One of the senior engineers even asked her to review his test configuration, something unthinkable just a few months earlier. She said yes, not because she wanted validation, but because the work deserved it. Her notebook grew heavier with notes, diagrams, ideas for systems not yet built. She still wrote in it daily, the pages filled with sketches, calculations, and thoughts that stretched beyond the walls of the hangar. She had begun to think about more than the next repair. She was designing now, drafting improvements not just for the current engine, but for what could come next. They had doubted her, dismissed her, overlooked her at every step. But she had done the work anyway, with precision, with dedication, with an unshakable belief that her skill would speak where her voice had been silenced. The SEAL captain had seen what others wouldn't. And that moment, that single pause of recognition, had opened a door that could no longer be closed. She hadn't demanded respect. She had earned it in the language of performance, in the sound of an engine that ran perfectly under pressure, in the quiet mark left behind where no one else thought to look. Now, whether they admitted it or not, everyone in that hangar knew who had made it possible.